This is Democracy,
a podcast about the people of the United States.
A podcast about citizenship.
About engaging with politics and the world around you.
A podcast about educating yourself on today's important issues
and how to have a voice in what happens next.
Welcome to our new episode of This is Democracy. This week, we are going to talk about the issue which is all over our news today. It's an old issue, but it's now been made new again. This is the issue of Iran's development of nuclear weapons and the concerns that has raised for Israel, for the United States, for many other countries. In the last few days, Israel began a series of military strikes on Iran, which were then followed up by American military strikes aimed specifically at Iran's nuclear facilities. We're going to talk about why this happened, how we came to this moment, how we understand this moment, not just from a strategic perspective, but also for the future of democracy in various regions of the world, and then think a little bit about where we might be going. This is yet another war in our contemporary world. We've talked a lot about the Ukraine war on this podcast, and now there's another war we have to talk about. We're joined by one of my favorite and most distinguished writers on this topic. This is Stephen Simon. He's a senior research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft in Washington, D.C. He's also a visiting professor at Dartmouth College and has been a visiting professor at various other major universities. He served for over 20 years in the State Department and on the National Security Council covering Middle East issues. He's written a number of books and important articles. I just want to highlight his most recent book, a book that is very prescient for the moment we're in. It's called Grand Delusion, The Rise and Fall of U.S. Ambition in the Middle East. It was published in 2023. It's a book I've assigned a couple of times already to students. It provides really a panoramic history of American foreign policy in the Middle East from Jimmy Carter through Barack Obama, and is very insightful about, in Stephen's terms, the deluded aims the United States has had, or the limits of American power that have repeatedly surprised American presidents and American citizens operating in this region. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure's all mine.
Great to have you on. Before we get started, we have, of course, Mr. Zachary's scene-setting poem. What's the title of your poem, Zachary?
The Stars.
The Stars. Let's hear it.
It has been hard of late to see the stars, the city lights nocturnal, the haze that settles over us in pockets of humidity. It has been hard of late to breathe the air below the streets. It's warm and smells of must. The late nights and the mornings are the same. It has been hard of late to find the sea. The smoke from the horizon crowds the coast like beachgoers blowing up on the sands. It has been hard of late to see the stars, the skies so full of rockets, the air so full of ash. It has been hard of late to see the stars, our eyes so full of dust, so full of tears.
Very moving poem, Zachary. What is your poem about?
My poem is about the way in which this sort of geopolitical conflict occurs when people are just sort of living their ordinary lives, and how strange it is to see these images of skies in Tel Aviv or Iran lit up by rockets and interceptors, and the sort of exchange of fire between both sides becomes this weird kind of light show in the sky.
Right. Fireworks of a diabolical kind in many respects. Mm-hmm. Stephen, I think that's a good place to turn to you. First of all, are you surprised by the moment we're in right now of Israel undertaking these extensive strikes in Iran and the United States joining them in the way the United States has?
No, I'm not. What we're watching the Israelis do in Iran now is something that the Israelis have been preparing to do for, 10 or 15 years now, and they've been approaching, the problem very systematically. And what we're seeing is the fruition of this long-standing program. Deep strike is the idiomatic translation of it into English. In Hebrew, it's a little bit different, but but the Israelis have invested a huge amount in it, and they, for some reason, which I haven't really grappled with yet. They refrained from putting it into motion until October 7th, really. And October 7th was, as we know, a deranging event in a lot of ways, and and it opened the door to Israeli thinking about, well, maybe this is the time to unleash this thing that we have created. And in the process, they have come to dominate, in a sense, Lebanese politics. They've established a sphere of influence in Syria, and now they have essentially subdued Iran, militarily. Obviously not politically in any sense, but regime change is certainly on their to-do list for Iran. It's their it's their objective, and it has to be their objective for reasons that we can talk about. But I think it's an imperative for Israel from Israel's perspective. It's an imperative, and that the United States joined in doesn't surprise me in the least. What's so interesting is about the U.S. involvement is the way in which it reflects the subordination of the United States to Israel's strategic objectives in the region. That's fascinating.
On paper, at least, it looks in this moment like Iran might be at its weakest in a long time, at least in many decades, with its proxies in Lebanon and around the region reduced by Israeli military force, and now with potentially catastrophic strikes on its nuclear program. Do you buy that argument about Iranian weakness?
Yes, I do, I'd say. But I never believed that they were strong. And it's one of the reasons why I've been so skeptical about the thrust of U.S. policy, let alone, Israeli policy toward Iran, because, they don't strike me as a powerful state. Objectively, if you just look at secular factors, they're not, they're not a very impressive country by most metrics, and certainly not militarily. It's got no power projection capability. It does so through, ragtag proxies, and the gains that it had made using its proxy forces over time have been equally unimpressive. Anyway, but from that perspective, from that standpoint, the vulnerability of Iran to this Israeli onslaught, which again they've been preparing for a long time, is completely unsurprising.
And so, what had Iran done, knowing as you did that Israel was planning for this? That I think that was an open secret. Netanyahu had been publicly calling for Israeli military action against Iran for a long time, since prior presidents were in office in the United States, and often the United States had said no. What did Iran do to prepare for this, or did it not prepare for this?
That's a terrific question, and I don't know the answer, because at looking at the surface of Iranian activity prior to this latest phase in its conflict with Israel and the United States, there was very little that it did or could do apart from stockpiling a lot of ballistic missiles and assuming that those ballistic missiles would deter Israeli or American aggression. And I think they really believed in the invulnerability of Hezbollah, and they relied on Hezbollah as a kind of strategic deterrent to Israeli or American military operations directed against Iran or its nuclear program. But it turned out that Hezbollah itself was something of a paper tiger, and the Israelis approached them over time, covertly in an utterly ruthless way that culminated in the pager attacks, and those attacks decimated the mid-level command echelon, the technocrats and administrators and lower level commanders in Hezbollah throughout Lebanon, severely injuring 3,000 of them. I mean, with disabling,
Yes.
injuries, and then they wiped out the chain of command, including the head of Hezbollah. It was really quite extraordinary. And the old joke about no one expects the Spanish Inquisition. Well, no one expected this tornado of violence that the Israelis were able to unleash. And I'm sure that the Iranians and Hezbollah both were surprised by their own incapacity.
What about the Iranian nuclear program, the sort of ostensible cause of the latest round of violence between Israel and Iran? How real do you think the threat of an Iranian nuclear weapon was, and how real does it remain after these strikes?
Well, the threat of an Iranian nuclear weapon it was containable at one point through negotiation. And that was, the thrust of the Obama administration's effort to negotiate this joint coordinated plan of action. I forget the exact
JCPOA, right?
Yeah, the JCPOA, the P5+1 deal with Iran over its nuclear program, and
just for our listeners, Stephen, that was the deal that the Obama administration concluded with the Iranian government. That I think where the Iranian government promised for 10 years not to move toward building a nuclear weapon in return for lifting of some sanctions and things of that kind. Correct?
But for an additional 5 years after that 10-year sunset, if you will, the agreement obligated Iran to abide by some very serious and intrusive inspection mechanism.
Yes.
Which would have, created serious obstacles to an Iranian sprint for a bomb. If they chose to do that the minute that the 10-year phase of this agreement lapsed. So.
Right.
It was a pretty good agreement, and it bought the signatories a lot of time. But anyway, the United States squandered that, and President Trump, in his first term, withdrew the United States from that agreement. But that agreement, it should be noted, allowed Iran to conduct enrichment of uranium on its own soil, up to a level of 3.67%, which is the kind of enriched fuel you need to run up, either a power or research reactor. But it's not enough to fuel a nuclear weapon.
Right.
It's well below that level, in fact. So the Iranians got what they wanted: a degree of sanctions relief, plus enrichment on their own soil. A fuel cycle is what people call it, and everybody was reasonably but manageably unhappy with the deal. It didn't give the United States and everything that the United States wanted. There were things that were simply left out of the negotiations, including missile proliferation.
Right.
And we're kind of seeing the results of that play out now in the missile war between Israel and Israel and Iran, and between Iran and Qatar. Now, a small country on the Arab side of the Gulf, where the United States has a large air base, which was targeted by the Iranians using these missiles. So, that wasn't dealt with, and the Iranians, were not going to sign up to some kind of 100-year deal on nuclear issues, but such a deal would have been unusual in the annals of diplomacy in any case.
Correct.
Agreements are generally of shorter duration. There's a sunset, and then the parties have the option of re-entering the agreement, renewing it, renegotiating it, or walking away from it if that's what they chose to do under whatever circumstances prevailed at that moment. So, it was a good deal, but the Republicans really hated it. And many people anticipated that if the Republicans were in the White House, following the Obama administration, that they would walk away from it, and sure enough, they did. But in the meantime, because the Iranians regarded themselves as unshackled from their obligations under the agreement by the U.S. withdrawal from it, they accumulated a fairly large stockpile in the interim of enriched uranium that was good enough to fuel a nuclear weapon. And they accumulated enough for about 9 or 10 weapons. And it was sitting there, mostly in Isfahan, in this storage facility, which in this most recent conflict, the Iranians had the foresight to empty out before it could be struck by Israelis, or Americans. So that fuel is out there somewhere, and perhaps people in governments know where it is. It's certainly not public information, and it may be that no one apart from the Iranians know where it is right now. But anyway, the accumulation of this material plus increasing tensions between Iran and Israel, and the vast stockpile of ballistic missiles that the Iranians had acquired really stoked Israeli threat perceptions.
Yes. And then, of course, as you said, the trauma of October 7th, 2023, the attack on Israel and the death and hostage taking of so many Israelis, it seems in some ways that was an Israeli 9/11, yes?
Yeah, and look, I think this crisis, I think October 7th and what happened afterwards, especially in Gaza, has taken some particularly grisly or ghastly, directions. But it does need to be recalled, I think, or at least understood, that I think the Israelis had just had enough of being told that they were illegitimate. They had no place in the region. The land they occupied was not their own. And one understands all the historical and ideological, pulsation, underlying challenges to Israel's legitimacy. But the fact is, if you're an Israeli, it really gets on your nerves after a while. And when it was expressed in the form of this kind of sadistic Hamas attack of October 7th, I think something in Israel really snapped. And, that's not very political sciencey, but, there it is. It's the best, I can do at the moment. Something did snap. And for those cinema aficionados who watched Godfather 1, they took a look around, and they turned into Clemenza with the shotgun, and and they were going to just take out the heads of the five families. That's what happened in The Godfather. And the Israelis just said, we're going to take out the heads of the five families. We just can't deal with this anymore. And we now have the capacity to do something about it through this investment that we've made in this is Israeli speaking, through the investment that was made in their depth command, in their deep strike command.
Stephen, your book makes such a powerful argument that time and again, those who have sought a solution, whatever that solution is, to the problems of the region, Camp David with Carter, an Israeli-Egyptian agreement, later efforts, James Baker trying after the first Persian Gulf War, that time and again efforts to solve the problems in the region, as Israel is trying to solve it now, I guess, have failed because of the complexity and the determination of various actors to resist these solutions. Do you see this as a similar moment today?
I do. I do. And perhaps, I'm trapped by my own preconceptions. And I guess I need to be, aware of that. But I do think we're looking at just a repetition of past disasters. And look at the Israelis for a moment. So they have established what looks like a kind of hegemonic presence, at least in the northern tier of the Middle East. Now, if you're a political scientist, you're going to say, well, you can't talk about hegemony in this context, because the thing about a hegemon is that it's got affinity groups in the countries that it controls who will do its dirty work for it. That's how you know you're a hegemon. When the country you control, the leadership of that country, they mow the lawn for you. And it's worth noting that the Israelis don't have anything like such affinity groups in any of the countries that they control or they're attempting to control. They've got no friends in Iran. They've got no friends in Syria. They've got no friends in Lebanon, and their friends in Egypt and in Jordan, are not. They're. I think they're reliable, of course, but I wouldn't call them real affinity groups.
Yeah. So
So
this is what I worry about, Stephen, though. I mean, can Israel survive without affinity groups in the region? And in the past, as you pointed out in your book, it's relied on the U.S. Is that going to be enough? Is that enough of a basis for continued Israeli survival?
well, states are really hard to kill. So I'm not. I guess I'm not, overly concerned about the survival, of Israel as a state. I assume it's there to stay. There are those who argue that, well, it's a kind of a Malthusian argument that, ultimately the Arab migratory patterns will swamp Israel. That Israel won't be able to keep them out, and the demographic balance will shift so radically that, well, the Israelis are going to wind up looking like the Maronites in Lebanon, a small beleaguered community hugging, cities on the coast, and relying on the protection of foreign powers to render them still viable. And the analogy, for people who make that argument is the southern border of the U.S. Where there's this sometimes factual, sometimes imagined, big wave of migrants coming into the United States that can't be stopped. But see, the thing is, the analogy kind of breaks down because the Israelis, do have manageable borders, and they're not afraid to shoot.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think that they can control all that. The real dangers to Israel, I think, stem from two two threats. The one is that if they keep doing the kinds of things they're doing, they'll make enemies in the region that will be determined to take revenge,
Right, right.
and that's going to be a problem for them. And then at the same time, there's a threat from within,
Yeah.
because the demographic trends, in the country are not favorable. And I'm not talking about the Arab-Jewish balance. I'm talking about the balance within the society of Israeli Jews, between the very Orthodox and the secular and less Orthodox Jews,
Yeah.
and that's going to be a problem for the viability of the state over time.
Stephen, we always like to close bringing this really thoughtful analysis, and you've helped capture, as I knew you would, the complexity of this region for us. We always like to close with something at least that our listeners can look to as a positive way forward. Is there anything positive that we can look toward?
Um,
It's a hard one for this region, I know.
I'm wasting my 1 minute to spread light and joy over the airwaves. But uh, it's there are some parts of the Arab world, I think, that are doing pretty well and will continue to do fairly well for decades. And I'm thinking of parts of the Persian Gulf littoral, Qatar and United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman. I mean, I think that they'll do nicely, and of course, the Saudis, will do extremely well. I think, Iraq shows a lot of promise. I've been there, not in the past year, but I've spent a fair amount of time there, I'm impressed actually by how much progress Iraq has made, and I have some. No, I'm hopeful about Iraq's prospects, and that's important. It's got a big population. It's right in the heart of the Middle East, and I do wish them well. I mean, I wish
Yeah,
everyone in the region
yeah.
well, obviously, but I think there's some hope, for them. But otherwise, I think prospects are really dim, especially when one takes into consideration the uh, the Tyrannosaurus Rex outside the door in the form of climate change. That's going to be an immiserating prospect, for the Middle East, especially in states that are already in trouble, like Syria.
So Stephen, this portrait you paint of a region that has some areas of progress, but continued conflict and problems, a region which will not be free of violence anytime soon, in the way you've described it. Um, what should the United States do? I mean, you spent much of your career and then your post-policy career writing about U.S. policy. What would you advise this administration if they came to you for advice? I hope they do come to you for advice. What would you advise them to do?
Well, restart USAID, is maybe step number one. The Agency for International Development was, quite an important, um, component in a larger, multilateral effort to relieve, poverty and serious, economic and 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 health issues, worldwide, and that was a U.S. agency that was disestablished under Doge, the Elon Musk reformatting of government that began when Trump came into office earlier this year. So the first thing I'd say is get USAID up and running again. And the second would be you need to start working with the Saudis and the Emiratis in particular to create a safety net for states in the Middle East, societies in the Middle East, populations that are going to be very hard hit over time, especially because of climate change. And there are things that those two countries can do, and I think they'd be willing to do actually to help out. So that's second. Third is continue and intensify what they're already doing in Syria, which is investing in Syrian infrastructure. That's a country that was crushed by civil war and sanctions following the civil war, which made both public and private investment in Syria forbiddingly difficult. From a legal perspective, the Trump administration has, I'm happy to report, eliminated sanctions, at least for the time being, on Syria, and that's had the effect of unleashing some of this investment that the Syrian people really need. So I think, that's a pretty good measure that I think that could be taken. Beyond this, beyond this requires dealing with Israel in a somewhat different way than the United States has related to Israel, at least recently, and it's going to be difficult to do because Israel has succeeded over time in leveraging the structure of American politics in a way that make successive U.S. administrations of either party make it very difficult for them to counter Israeli policies which are detrimental to U.S. interests and perhaps the interests of others, and this needs to be rebalanced somewhat, and it needs to be rebalanced in first to alleviate the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, and secondly, to come to some negotiated resolution of Israel's dispute with Iran. It's a reciprocal dispute. I mean, the Iranians have done their utmost to elicit Israeli fear and animosity. This didn't arise spontaneously within Israel's psyche. There were two countries at play here, and the Iranians bear a great responsibility, for the way in which this crisis has evolved, and the way in which they've stirred Israeli fears, and then having done so, tried to build a nuclear weapon. So that needs to be resolved. It can only be resolved by intensive diplomacy, but the Israelis have to buy into the diplomatic effort, whatever diplomatic process the United States would undertake on behalf of both the Iranians and the Israelis and the region as a whole, because we can already see the war spreading, and that's a very untoward thing. So I guess those are the areas where I'd focus, and already that's a huge to-do list for
Absolutely. That's more than any president has accomplished in the region. You're talking multiple Camp Davids and multiple shuttle diplomacies. Zachary, as a young person who pays close attention to these issues, in part because of your Jewish connection to the region, but also because of your interest and concern about foreign policy and concern about humanitarian issues. Is what Stephen's saying does it make sense to you? Is this something that can motivate young people? Because it could only be pursued as a set of policies by an administration if it has some popular support within the United States, right? So how do you react to that long list of negotiations, compromises, restructuring of relationships that Stephen laid out?
I think so. I think one of the most interesting things to watch has been the sort of split within the Republican Party over Iran, with some of the most far-right Republicans expressing concern either over the administration's failure to get congressional approval for the strikes or the very idea of American involvement in another overseas conflict. I think what that shows is not that those people are right. I don't think they are, but that the American public is skeptical of American involvement overseas, which I think in some ways can be a positive force if it forces more serious planning process and a more serious approach to involvement overseas, less sort of willy-nilly assumption of American power, which I maybe don't have full confidence in the current administration to oversee, but I think that is a positive force and it's a step in the right direction.
Do you agree, Stephen? Last final question, I promise. There's so much to talk about, but final question for now. Do you agree with Zachary that this split among Republicans and split within the United States, I think, deeply about whether we should remain involved in this region, especially after the difficulties of the Iraq War, that could actually be turned to positive use for diplomatic purposes as you laid it out?
Well, taking polling data regarding the U.S. strikes against Iran as a kind of a surrogate, they show the survey data show pretty clearly that a majority of Democrats oppose the strikes, and a large majority of Republicans support them. So we're not really talking about a split, within MAGA or within the Republicans. The real split is between Democrats and Republicans. And, Trump is, politically fairly shrewd. And he assessed, I think that the MAGA threat, as expressed by, Bannon and Tucker Carlson and others, was basically trivial. That at the end of the day, he controlled MAGA, and those guys might have large followings on the web or what have you. But the fact is, his approval ratings were far better than either of theirs. So so I'm going to go with Trump on this, that, the issue isn't really with, among Republicans. The issue is between Democrats and Republicans. And that's going to play out in interesting ways over time. So, for example, if you look at polling that cuts across age groups on the one hand and party affiliation, on the other, what you can see pretty clearly is that the younger age cohorts are very skeptical of the U.S.-Israeli relationship and don't have a very high opinion, of Israel, and that's very true. It's strikingly true among those young Americans who self-identify as Democrats, but it's also creeping upward among young Republicans. So right now, that really hasn't had much of an effect on anything because, Congress, understands pretty well that young people don't vote. And in any case, young people don't have a lot of money. So, they're not going to pay very much attention to these changes. But those young voters, in 10 years won't be so young anymore.
Right. Stephen, you've touched perfectly on a theme that runs through all 300 plus episodes of our podcast, which is that generational change matters, and that a new generation of voters, a new generation of people participating in our society and other societies are, even though it doesn't look that way all the time, they are going to have deep influence on these policies. And I think, if nothing else, we're in a moment of flux. That's where you started in describing this moment, and I think that's where we come out of this. Nothing is set in stone in the Middle East, even though people talk of ancient conflicts. They aren't ancient conflicts; they're current conflicts, and the history shows us that things can change and are changing in front of us. This is a conversation we need to conclude now, but we also need to continue because so many things are changing, and the region is so complex. I want to remind our listeners to read your book. And read your work and follow you and other scholars who are writing about this in detail. Stephen Simon's wonderful book, The Grand Delusion, The Rise and Fall of U.S. Ambition in the Middle East. I encourage you all to read that. Thank you, Stephen, so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Jeremy, and thanks, Zach. Carry on.
Yes, thank you, Zachary, for your poem about the stars, the strange stars we see in these moments. And thank you most of all to our loyal listeners and loyal subscribers to our Substack for joining us for this week of This Is Democracy.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts ITS Development Studio
and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Scott Holmes.
Stay tuned for a new episode every week.
You can find This Is Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube.
See you next time.